Hello and a very warm welcome wherever in the world you're watching. The world's biggest economy is thriving under my leadership. That was one of President Trump's key messages in his State of the Union speech. He called for unity during what is one of the highlights of the American political calendar. Let's have a listen.
In just over 2 years since the election, we have launched an unprecedented economic boom, a boom that has rarely been seen before. There's been nothing like it. We have created 5.3 million new jobs and, importantly, added 600,000 new manufacturing jobs, something which almost everyone said was impossible to do.
Well, Mr. Trump went on to say the only things that could stop the economic miracle taking place were, in his words, foolish wars, politics and ridiculous partisan investigations. Now, while there's no doubt the US jobs market is thriving, his claim of 5.3 million new jobs drew scrutiny. Official numbers show 4.9 million were added since he took office. He seems to have also included those since his election. Now, one big threat on the horizon is the global economic slowdown. The US Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, has raised that as an issue, and in December it cut its forecast for US growth for this year to 2.3%. The recent US government shutdown got no mention. It cost the economy an estimated $6 billion, but if another begins later this month, of course that figure will grow. President Trump went on to say the trade war with China was of paramount priority. He said a deal would need real structural change from Beijing, but of course the clock is ticking with a 1st of March deadline looming. Enough of the cube now. Few domestic policy references economically there, a lot of focus on the international side of things. Let's unpick all of that with Jay Shambaugh, who is director of the Hamilton Project at the Washington think tank, the Brookings Institution, and also a former economic advisor to President Obama. It's good to have you with us, Jay. So what does President Trump then need to do to make sure that this economic miracle, as he calls it, can continue and thrive in the face of a global economic slowdown?
Well, I guess what I'd say is, as you said, there's a very sunny view of the economy that was presented, and certainly the economy is doing pretty well right now. I wouldn't quite go so far as unprecedented, but it's doing well. But there wasn't much talk about some of the challenges we still face, whether it's wage growth that isn't still quite as high as we'd like to see it, especially for some Americans. Regional inequality that is definitely an issue in the United States, or in particular, I would worry about things around innovation or education. The fact that many people think the U.S. economy is less dynamic than it used to be. Startup rates are down. People don't move as much. There's increased concentration in the economy. These are all things that require policy attention. And I think on those, we didn't hear a lot last night.
What we did hear about was the view regarding a possible trade deal with China and the fact that President Trump says as a prerequisite, China needs to change its trade practices. This, as we hear just within the last hour or so, that Stephen Mnuchin will be going to Beijing next week to resume those talks. What do you think will be made of the tone that was set to those listening in China?
Well, I guess what I'd say is real structural change, which I think is actually something that is warranted, is pretty hard to pull off on a 90-day deadline. And so I think there is a little bit of a mismatch of goals and methods there. I think there are a lot of policies that China has employed for a long time that require some changes. I think you look at the recent indictment of Huawei, where there are some real challenging things going on that really need to be addressed. And those have been things that have been investigated and looked into for many years now. They don't change overnight. It's good to raise them, it's good to emphasize them, but if the bar is going to be that those things get fixed in 90 days, I think that's really going to be a problematic thing to meet. If the question is, can we come to some sort of agreement that's smaller and that sets goals for over time, that's great, but then you need persistent, consistent diplomacy over time, and realistically with more allies on board. So instead of having kind of trade spats with your allies, working together to try to change some of China's policies.
And Jay, just briefly, I know you're a former economic advisor to President Obama. What's it like when you're assessing the fallout from what is a key speech in the calendar?
always was fascinating to watch because those speeches are moving up until the last minute. There's a lot of discussion of what goes in and what doesn't go in. And so you're almost wondering to see, making sure things actually did come out the way you thought everything had gotten ironed out. And then to try to see how people think about it. You're trying to set your agenda. I think, as many people noted in this speech, there wasn't quite as much policy detail as you sometimes see in the State of the Union. I don't know if more of that will come out when they release a budget soon. So in that sense, I think there's less of an opportunity to say, well, what happened and how did people react to specific policies, because there really wasn't as much there in terms of specifics.
Okay, Jay Shambaugh, thank you very much indeed for talking to us. Now, what was the last track that you listened to? And the reason I'm asking is because we're talking Spotify. The world's most popular music streaming service has reported its